Are human beings basically good or bad? Good, bad, neither, both? Oh dear, this is a very tricky question. There is, of course, the basic question of how to decide what constitutes good and bad in the first place. Let's make a stab at explaining what these terms might mean. I think we all have some kind of intuitive understanding of what these terms might mean, even though we would almost certainly differ about which precise actions should be regarded as good or bad. So we have a sense of good and bad, but working out which actions fit into each category is difficult. But maybe for this exercise we don't need to. Maybe we've got enough to go on. Assuming that we're able to determine what the right action is in a given situation, according to our own values and our power of reasoning, do we always take that action? If we do, does that make us a good person? Note that we may disagree about whether or not the action in itself was the proper and right action. We may come to the conclusion that it wasn't. But if the person who performed the action believed it was, does that make them a good person? We could probably ask whether the person had performed due diligence before carrying out the action. But again, let's assume that they had undertaken such diligence as could be reasonably expected. Well, I suppose that gives them a tick in the good column. But a single good action presumably is not enough to determine whether or not a person is good. How many bad actions is a person permitted before they can no longer be regarded as a good person? 50%? More than 50%? 25%? I think we can begin to see from this that goodness, as applied to a person rather than an individual act, is going to be somewhere on a spectrum. People are going to be neither entirely good nor entirely bad, but a mix of both. It's fair to say that not all of us do the right thing all the time. In fact, probably no one does the right thing all the time. Why is that? First of all, I think we all have a very deep-seated streak of self-interest. It takes quite an effort, quite a lot of willpower sometimes, to go against our own self-interest. And sometimes the right action does require that of us. In fact, I suspect that most of us would place higher value on a good act performed at some significant cost to the actor. The more a person acts against their own self-interest, it seems, the greater the moral value of that act. Some acts even require the ultimate sacrifice. They require the person to sacrifice their own life. A good act that causes us no harm, or maybe even benefits us also, is perceived as having less moral value. It would be difficult to find a reason not to do the right thing in that situation. Frequently, however, we surrender to our own self-interest rather than perform what we know to be the right action. We have a tendency to place our own needs above the needs of others, although our sense of self, our sense of me, I, can sometimes extend beyond just ourselves to include those who are closest to us. We see ourselves as the centre of the universe, and why wouldn't we? After all, up, down, right, left, back, forward, before and after, all of these coordinates of space-time are defined in terms of I. Of course we're selfish, which is again why an action that overrides this natural instinct is regarded as having a higher moral worth. Frequently, we also surrender to an immediate desire, even if a good action may bring us some future benefit. We're not always very good at delaying gratification. This is something we have to learn as we grow. I think it's around the age of 3 years old or something that we begin to learn to postpone our gratification. But some people learn it better than others, and none of us learn it perfectly. We're inclined to choose immediate gratification, an immediate reward we're certain of, rather than a delayed reward. even a guaranteed delayed reward, let alone one that's only a possibility. So there are two quite strong forces operating against performing an action which may be regarded objectively, even by you, the actor, as of high moral worth: an innate self-interest and a desire for immediate gratification. Whether any human being is good or bad is hardly something I can determine even about myself, let alone anyone else, though this does not in any way eliminate the need to judge or, if necessary, penalise bad actions. Fortunately, in this process we depend on a collective judgment: trial, judge, jury, legal precedent, rather than just on our own individual judgment. Ultimately, of course, there's no yes-no answer to the question of whether human beings are good or bad, whether a particular individual or the entire species. We're all somewhere on this spectrum. It's also worth noting that doing the right thing sometimes involves going against some very deeply rooted instincts. We've proved that we can do that, and also that often we can't. That we have to make such decisions and judgments is a consequence of our living in community. Thankfully, and for the same reason, we don't have to make these judgments alone.